To mask George's consuming obsession with his own uncle, the Greek throne forced him into a sham marriage with the wealthiest woman in France. No love, no respect, just a wedding night spent sobbing on the floor, and half a century of locking a brilliant mind inside a gilded cage. This is the true price of royal perfection. The brutal reality of the European royal courts in the late 19th century was governed by incredibly conservative, strict political and financial transactions rather than personal desire. Homosexuality was legally and socially ruinous. Yet, beneath the rigid protocol of these palaces, a bizarre tolerance existed for open secrets, as long as the facade of dynastic duty was maintained. Marie Bonaparte was selected. She was the great-grandniece of Napoleon I and the heiress to the massive Blanc fortune from the Monte Carlo casino. She was staggeringly wealthy, deeply intellectual, and desperate for an authentic romance. She was a woman who sought truth and deep connection. This made her the absolute worst possible candidate to serve as a silent, compliant beard for a man utterly consumed by another. The trap was sprung in 1907. George and Marie were married in a glittering public ceremony designed to appease the masses and replenish the Greek royal coffers. The newspapers printed glowing photographs of the handsome prince and his wealthy princess. The moment the public celebrations ended, the facade violently crumbled. On that disastrous wedding night, Marie was met with a broken and grieving man. Historical diaries suggest that George suffered a severe breakdown. He sat weeping bitterly, overwhelmed by the reality of his marriage and completely paralyzed by his longing for Valdemar. He could not and would not perform the role expected of him. Marie Bonaparte, highly perceptive and intelligent, stood in her bridal chamber completely isolated. She watched her new husband cry for his uncle. From that very first night, a terrible chain reaction was set in motion. Marie was immediately relegated to the role of a convenient shield. She became a living, breathing piece of camouflage for a love story in which she had no actual part. As the years ground on, the dual timelines of George's life began to sharply diverge. This created a torturous environment for everyone trapped inside the palace walls. The forced separation of his marriage did nothing to cool George's devotion to his uncle. If anything, the distance poured gasoline on the flames of his obsession. George wrote hundreds of letters to Valdemar. These were not the standard correspondences of a nephew checking in on an older relative. They were passionate, desperately possessive letters, laced with the heavy language of a tragic romance. George constantly referred to his feelings as his despairing love. He swore eternal loyalty and expressed vicious jealousy toward anyone else who commanded Valdemar's attention. He constantly lamented the cruel fate that kept them apart. When they were finally reunited, George's entire demeanor transformed. The stiff, often irritable prince, who shared a house with Marie, suddenly became radiant, youthful, and completely animated. They immediately resumed their old habits. They held hands, spent hours in completely private conversation, and entirely excluded the rest of the world. But this profound emotional connection had a dark and parasitic edge. Whenever Valdemar had to leave, or if George felt even a perceived slight, George would plunge into severe psychological distress. He would suffer intense panic attacks. He fell physically ill and took to his bed like an abandoned, terrified child. He weaponized his own physical and mental fragility. He used his emotional collapse to manipulate Valdemar into staying closer, writing more often, and constantly reassuring him of his absolute primacy in Valdemar's heart. Parallel to this exhausting emotional theater was the quiet, brutal reality of Princess Marie. She was a woman of immense vitality and intellect, trapped in a gilded cage. Her husband viewed her with, at best, apologetic indifference. George fulfilled his bare minimum dynastic duty, and they had 2 children. But the marital bed was otherwise entirely cold and dead. Marie was left to navigate the profound daily humiliation of being the third wheel in her own marriage. She was not a passive victim. She fiercely sought to understand the bizarre dynamic that was draining her youth. She kept extensive, painful diaries detailing her extreme isolation. She documented the crushing reality of watching her husband's face light up only when the post arrived, with a letter bearing a Danish stamp. The depth of this tragedy lay in a stark, agonizing contrast. A prince so consumed by his obsession with his uncle that he entirely abandoned his duties as a present husband and father, existing alongside a princess forced to become a phantom in her own home. Marie's suffering was acute specifically because she understood exactly what was happening. She was never oblivious. She saw the matching clothes. She heard the sheer desperation in George's voice when he spoke of Valdemar. She bore the brunt of his dark irritability whenever Valdemar was absent. Prince George did not end up in Denmark by accident. His father, King George I of Greece, was originally a Danish prince who had been placed on the newly created Greek throne. The Greek court was highly unstable, surrounded by political turmoil and constant threats of assassination. To ensure his second son received a strict, disciplined military upbringing, the king sent young George back to his own homeland. He was enrolled in the Danish Royal Navy, a brutal and unforgiving environment for a boy accustomed to the warmth and relative freedom of the Mediterranean. George arrived in Copenhagen deeply homesick, culturally isolated and desperate for an anchor. The Danish court was rigid, but the Naval Academy was even harsher. It was in this cold, hyper-masculine environment that Prince Valdemar stepped into the void. Valdemar provided the only warmth in George's isolated world. He took the young prince under his direct supervision, ostensibly to guide his rigorous military training. The relationship rapidly morphed into something far more consuming and permanent. George was completely vulnerable, and he clung to Valdemar for sheer emotional survival. Valdemar in turn found himself the center of this young man's absolute, uncritical worship. The strict, male-only confines of the naval barracks and warships provided the perfect, unquestionable cover for their bond to flourish. They spent months together at sea, completely isolated from the prying eyes and rigid protocols of the royal court. In the claustrophobic quarters of naval vessels, their intimacy deepened into an unbreakable emotional monopoly. As George grew into adulthood, his physical stature became imposing, but his psychological dependency remained that of a terrified child. His family back in Greece recognized the intensity of the bond, but they chose to exploit it rather than correct it. When George was appointed High Commissioner of the Cretan state, a highly volatile and dangerous political position, he was disastrously unprepared. His mind was not on the geopolitical struggles of the Mediterranean. It was entirely fixated on Copenhagen. He spent his days writing frantic, obsessive letters to Valdemar, neglecting his duties and alienating his political allies. Many historians note that his tenure in Crete was a resounding failure. This was largely because his emotional focus remained fixated thousands of miles away. He functioned only as a shell of a leader, hollowed out by his constant, agonizing separation from his uncle. While George was failing in Crete, Marie Bonaparte was fighting her own silent war in France. She was the product of immense, almost incomprehensible wealth and profound emotional neglect. Her grandfather, François Blanc, had built the Monte Carlo casino, amassing a fortune that rivaled the treasuries of small nations. Her mother died shortly after giving birth to her, leaving Marie in the care of a distant aristocratic father who viewed her primarily as a financial asset. Marie grew up surrounded by sycophants and fortune hunters, developing a sharp, cynical intellect to protect herself. She read voraciously, studying philosophy and science, desperate to find a genuine connection in a world that only saw her bank accounts. She was incredibly smart, but she was also deeply lonely, a dangerous combination for a woman navigating the marriage markets of high society. The Greek royal family was perpetually on the brink of bankruptcy. They desperately needed an infusion of capital to maintain their standing in Europe. The Bonaparte Blanc fortune was the perfect target. King George I orchestrated the match with clinical precision. Marie saw in Prince George a strikingly handsome man and a legitimate royal title that could elevate her above the sneers of the old French aristocracy. She believed she was purchasing her freedom and securing a partner who would respect her intellect. George went through the motions of the courtship flawlessly, displaying a quiet, detached demeanor that Marie tragically mistook for aristocratic reserve. He played the part of the dutiful suitor, hiding the agonizing truth of his emotional enslavement behind a mask of royal protocol. The illusion shattered violently on the night of their wedding. The tears George wept on the floor of their bridal chamber were not a temporary panic. They were a permanent declaration of his condition. Marie realized with brutal clarity that she had been completely deceived. Her vast fortune had merely bought her a front row seat to her husband's lifelong obsession with another man. She refused to play the role of the silent, suffering martyr. In the days following the disastrous wedding night, she confronted George directly. She demanded an explanation for his coldness and his constant frantic correspondence with Denmark. George did not offer apologies or promises of a better future. He simply gave her the blunt, devastating truth. George admitted that Valdemar was the absolute center of his universe, and that he was physically and emotionally incapable of offering her anything more than a legal title. Marie was trapped. Divorce in the early 20th century royal circles was virtually impossible without causing a catastrophic scandal that would ruin both families. She was forced to adapt to a grotesque domestic arrangement. They maintained the public performance of a happy, functioning royal couple, attending galas and state dinners with practiced smiles. But behind the doors of their private residences, they lived entirely separate lives. George spent his days waiting for the mail, his mood entirely dictated by the arrival or delay of Valdemar's letters. Marie was left to wander the halls of her lavish homes, fully aware that she was utterly irrelevant to the man she had married. The emotional violence of this arrangement began to take a severe physical toll on Marie. She developed chronic ailments, insomnia, and deep bouts of depression. She felt her youth and vitality being drained away by a man who looked right through her. It was this profound, crushing isolation that eventually drove her to seek answers outside the confines of the royal court. She realized that the medical and social establishments of the time had no vocabulary for the psychological torture she was enduring. They expected her to be quiet, to bear children, and to ignore her husband's blatant obsession. But Marie's intellect would not allow her to accept this slow death. She began to read the early controversial works of a relatively unknown doctor in Vienna named Sigmund Freud, searching for a way to diagnose the madness that had consumed her life. Refusing to drown in the despair her husband meticulously cultivated, Marie weaponized her own isolation, turning her immense intellectual capacity toward the emerging science of the human mind. She traveled to Vienna to meet Sigmund Freud. She did not go simply as a wealthy, bored royal seeking a cure for aristocratic melancholy. She went as a woman fighting for her own psychological survival. She laid out the brutal realities of her marriage, the profound deception she faced from the very beginning, and the bizarre, consuming presence of Prince Valdemar in her daily life. Freud immediately recognized her brilliant, analytical mind. He helped her understand that George's condition was not her fault, nor was it a temporary phase she could cure through wifely devotion or patience. George was permanently locked in a state of arrested emotional development. He was entirely tethered to the man who had served as his surrogate father, his brother, and his absolute idol. Marie began to use psychoanalysis as a protective shield. She stopped expecting George to be a traditional husband and started observing him as a clinical case study. The daily reality of their household was a masterclass in emotional manipulation and unspoken cruelty. Whenever Prince Valdemar visited their home in Paris or Greece, George underwent a terrifying psychological transformation. He instantly reverted to the behavior of an anxious, entirely dependent adolescent. The two men, now well into middle age, would sequester themselves in private rooms for hours at a time. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, shutting Marie out completely from their shared world. They stubbornly continued their bizarre habit of wearing identical suits, presenting a unified, impenetrable front to the rest of the household. Marie was forced to sit at her own dining table and play the gracious hostess, while her husband openly fawned over his uncle. The humiliation was absolute and relentless. The European elite who attended these dinners simply drank the Bonaparte wine, ate the expensive food, and pretended not to notice the grotesque dynamic playing out right in front of them. The true horror of George's condition revealed itself whenever Valdemar prepared to leave their home. The mere sight of a servant packing a trunk was enough to send George into a spiraling, violent panic attack. He would hyperventilate, weep openly in the hallways, and take to his bed, claiming to be deathly ill. He weaponized these manufactured physical crises to guilt Valdemar into delaying his departure. It was a vicious cycle of emotional blackmail. George willingly traded his dignity and his royal composure for a few extra days of his uncle's physical presence. Valdemar, for his part, rarely discouraged this frantic behavior. He seemed to enjoy the absolute, unquestioning adoration that George provided. It fed his ego to know that a prince of Greece was entirely paralyzed without his approval and constant attention. Into this toxic, suffocating environment, 2 children were eventually born. Prince Peter and Princess Eugenie were brought into the world strictly to fulfill the basic dynastic requirements of the Greek royal house and to secure the Bonaparte inheritance. George viewed his children with a detached clinical obligation. He had absolutely no emotional bandwidth left to be a father. Every ounce of his love, his anxiety, and his attention was already hoarded by Valdemar. Marie was left to raise the children almost entirely on her own. She tried desperately to shield them from the cold, gaping void at the very center of their family. She attempted to provide the warmth and stability that their father was completely incapable of giving. Yet the children grew up acutely aware that their home was fundamentally broken. They saw their father actively ignore their mother. They saw him spring to life only when a letter arrived bearing a Danish postmark. They inherited the collateral damage of a possessive love story they were never meant to understand or be a part of. As the 20th century violently unfolded, the world outside their palace walls began to burn to the ground. The First World War shattered the old royal order of Europe. Ancient empires collapsed. Kings were exiled, and the political maps were entirely redrawn in blood. The Greek royal family was repeatedly thrown into exile, facing severe political instability and financial ruin. Yet, amidst this unprecedented global catastrophe, George's primary concern remained terrifyingly narrow and selfish. Bypassing the fall of dynasties and the loss of his family's geopolitical power, his single consuming terror remained the disruption of postal routes across war-torn Europe. The thought of losing his daily written correspondence with Valdemar paralyzed him far more than the very real threat of assassination or permanent exile. He sat in his quiet study, completely ignoring the collapse of Western civilization outside his window, obsessively tracking the train schedules to Copenhagen to ensure his letters would arrive safely. Time is the ultimate enemy of all obsessions. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, Prince Valdemar began to visibly age. The strong, imposing naval officer who had completely captured George's heart in his youth was slowly becoming a frail, vulnerable old man. For George, witnessing this physical decline was an apocalyptic event. He absolutely could not accept the mortality of his idol. His devotion morphed into a frantic, suffocating role as a permanent caretaker. He monitored Valdemar's diet, his sleep schedule, and his medical treatments with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. He became a self-appointed warden, attempting to imprison his uncle in a sterile bubble of safety to ward off the inevitable approach of death. This extreme, overbearing care exhausted Valdemar and alienated the rest of the Danish royal family, who wanted to spend time with their aging patriarch. But George did not care about social decorum or the feelings of others. He was a desperate man watching his only reason for living slowly slip through his fingers. Marie watched this desperate, pathetic struggle from a safe emotional distance. She no longer felt the agonizing sting of rejection that had defined her early marriage. Through her extensive, groundbreaking work with Freud, she had built her own empire of the mind. She translated Freud's major works into French, heavily funded his psychoanalytic societies across Europe, and became a highly respected scientific pioneer in her own right. She had successfully found her immense value entirely outside the suffocating, archaic restrictions of her royal marriage. When she looked at George, frantically trying to stop the clock and save his aging uncle from the grave, she felt a profound clinical pity. He was a man who had been given every conceivable advantage of birth, extreme wealth, and royal power, yet he had lived his entire adult life as a willing, emotional slave. He was permanently trapped in a psychological prison of his own making, and the walls were rapidly closing in. The tension in their household became truly unbearable as Valdemar's health entered its final, irreversible decline in the late 1930s. The letters from Denmark became less frequent, and Valdemar's handwriting grew increasingly shaky and weak. Every delayed telegram or missed phone call sent George into a fresh, agonizing wave of panic. He completely stopped attending to whatever minor royal and social duties he still held. He paced the floors of their Parisian mansion at all hours of the night, refusing to eat or sleep properly. He was simply waiting for the inevitable news that would finally shatter his reality and end his life as he knew it. Marie quietly prepared herself for the absolute collapse of her husband. She knew with scientific certainty that when Valdemar took his last breath, the Prince George she had known for decades would die right alongside him. She braced herself to clean up the wreckage of a man who had willingly sacrificed his marriage, neglected his children, and abandoned his own dignity on the altar of a forbidden, all-consuming obsession. The cold reality of mortality finally breached the walls of Prince George's meticulously constructed delusion in January of 1939. Prince Valdemar of Denmark, the absolute epicenter of George's existence, died at the age of 80. The news did not arrive as a quiet, expected conclusion to a long royal life. It struck George like a catastrophic physical blow that entirely shattered his psychological foundation. When the telegram reached the Bonaparte Greece household in Paris, George did not react with the dignified, restrained sorrow expected of a European prince. He collapsed completely. He unleashed a primal, devastating wail that echoed through the halls of their mansion, a sound so raw and terrifying that it forced the household staff to turn away in profound discomfort. This was not the grief of a nephew losing an elderly uncle. It was the absolute, unrestrained agony of a widower who had just watched his sole reason for drawing breath violently extinguished. The man who had spent over 50 years orchestrating his entire life around the approval, proximity, and attention of one single human being was suddenly and permanently untethered. He was left drifting in a dark, suffocating abyss of his own making, entirely incapable of processing a world that no longer contained Valdemar. The immediate aftermath of Valdemar's death exposed the grotesque hypocrisy of the European royal establishment in brutal clarity. The extended families of Greece, Denmark, and Britain gathered to mourn the passing of a senior patriarch. They were determined to maintain the stoic, emotionally detached optics required of their station. But George's sheer, unfiltered devastation shattered their careful decorum. He could not and would not hide the true nature of his loss. His public weeping, his physical inability to stand unsupported, and his obsessive, repetitive declarations of eternal devotion to the deceased made everyone in his orbit intensely uncomfortable. He laid bare the open secret that the courts had spent decades trying to ignore. By mourning Valdemar with the intensity of a lifelong romantic partner, George forced his family to silently acknowledge the exact nature of the relationship they had actively helped conceal. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and deep embarrassment. They quickly realized that the strong, handsome prince who had once represented the peak of dynastic pride was now nothing more than a hollowed-out shell, completely destroyed by the death of the man he was never officially allowed to love. While George was completely consumed by his own psychological annihilation, Marie Bonaparte was forced to navigate the wreckage. She did not express a single ounce of triumph or relief that her lifelong rival for her husband's affection was finally gone. Her clinical training and her sheer intellectual maturity elevated her far above petty vindictiveness. She looked at the pathetic, weeping man on her floor and saw only a catastrophic failure of human development. She recognized that George had never actually grown up. He had frozen in time as a terrified adolescent, completely dependent on the older man who had offered him a twisted form of salvation in the cold Danish naval barracks. Marie stepped into the void and took absolute control of the household. She managed the difficult logistics of the funeral arrangements, shielded George from the intrusive inquiries of the press, and silently absorbed the dark, irritable bitterness that George now radiated constantly. She became the ultimate, tragically ironic caretaker. The brilliant woman who had been utterly neglected, humiliated, and used as a convenient societal shield for over 30 years was now the only person capable of holding her husband's fractured mind together. The glaring contrast between the husband and wife had already reached its peak even before Valdemar's passing. While George spent his late years descending into anxious dependency, Marie was executing the most vital act of her life. In 1938, as the shadow of fascism consumed Europe and Hitler annexed Austria, Sigmund Freud was trapped in Vienna facing certain death. Marie did not hesitate. She personally traveled to the heart of the Nazi regime. She aggressively negotiated with the Gestapo, paid extortionate ransoms, and physically escorted Freud to safety in London. She returned to Paris having saved a brilliant mind, only to find her husband still weeping over old letters from Copenhagen. The outbreak of the Second World War entirely destroyed the comfortable, privileged world of the European aristocracy. But Prince George barely registered the collapse of the continent. When the German army invaded France, Marie hastily organized the evacuation of their household. They were forced to flee Paris, leaving behind the immense wealth and properties that had defined their public status. They became royal refugees, entirely dependent on the goodwill of distant relatives and international allies. Yet amidst the terrifying chaos of air raids, fleeing populations, and the constant threat of capture, George's internal reality remained completely static. He did not care about the fall of the French Republic or the existential threat to the Greek throne. His only profound sorrow was the physical distance separating him from Denmark. He was tormented by the fact that Valdemar's grave was now located deep within Nazi-occupied territory, making it entirely impossible for him to visit the tomb. He viewed the deadliest conflict in human history entirely through the narrow, selfish lens of how it inconvenienced his endless mourning. During the long, brutal years of the war, George's grief began to calcify into a deeply toxic and resentful bitterness. He was furious at the world for continuing to exist without Valdemar. He punished everyone around him for the crime of being alive while his uncle was dead. He became incredibly difficult to manage, lashing out at his servants, alienating his adult children, and directing a constant stream of cold hostility toward Marie. He seemed to resent her sheer vitality, her ongoing intellectual work, and her refusal to drown alongside him in his sea of depression. He demanded absolute silence in their temporary residences, refusing to participate in any conversations that did not directly revolve around his memories of his uncle. He forced Marie to endure endless repetitive monologues detailing Valdemar's supposed perfection, his naval career, and the exact phrasing of letters written 40 years prior. Marie sat and listened, offering no contradiction. She understood that challenging his delusions would only cause a violent escalation of his anxiety. She treated him as a terminal patient, providing palliative care for a disease of the soul that had no known cure. Marie utilized her psychoanalytic framework to survive the suffocating atmosphere of their exile. She studied her husband not as a partner, but as a tragic, walking manifestation of the dangers of repression and emotional possession. She documented his behaviors, noting how his lifelong inability to form a genuine, equal relationship had ultimately devoured his entire personality. She saw that George's love for Valdemar had never truly been about the uncle at all. It was about George's desperate, selfish need for an emotional anchor that required no vulnerability and no risk. Valdemar had been a mirror that reflected only the adoration George desperately craved. When the mirror broke, George ceased to exist as a functioning human being. Marie recognized that the royal system itself was the architect of this specific tragedy. By forcing a man who was clearly incapable of a heterosexual union into a politically motivated sham marriage, the establishment had guaranteed the destruction of at least 3 lives. They had prioritized the appearance of normalcy over the actual psychological survival of their own family members. As the war finally ended, and the surviving members of the European elite attempted to piece their shattered lives back together, George remained completely stagnant. He returned to Paris physically intact, but mentally, he was still standing over a grave in Copenhagen in January of 1939. He had no interest in rebuilding his life or reconnecting with his family. His body stubbornly refused to die, trapping him in a painful, drawn-out twilight that would last for another decade. He spent his final years meticulously organizing his massive archive of letters from Valdemar, tying them with ribbons and locking them in heavy safes as if they were state secrets. He was actively preparing for his own death, ensuring that the physical evidence of his lifelong obsession would survive him. He was methodically setting the stage for one final, deeply cruel act of possession, a final demand that would ensure his absolute loyalty to his uncle was permanently recorded in the stone of his very tomb, explicitly designed to erase the woman who had spent half a century keeping him alive. The post-war world had entirely moved on from the archaic, gilded cages of the 19th century royal courts, but Prince George remained stubbornly anchored to a reality that no longer existed. As the 1950s dawned, Europe was rebuilding itself from the ashes of the Second World War. A new era of modernity was sweeping across the continent. In London, his own nephew, Prince Philip, had married the young Queen Elizabeth II, stepping into the ultimate role of royal duty and public service. George watched this from a distance, entirely detached from the triumph of his own bloodline. He was a living relic, a man who possessed the titles and the pedigree of a senior European prince, but who functioned day to day as a hollowed-out monument to a dead Danish uncle. His physical health began to mirror his psychological decay. He grew increasingly frail, his once imposing naval stature shrinking into the posture of a deeply defeated old man. He rarely left his residence in Paris, preferring the suffocating safety of his private rooms where the walls were heavily adorned with faded photographs of Valdemar. He spent his days endlessly rereading the thousands of letters they had exchanged, tracing the handwriting of a man who had been dead for over a decade. He was essentially waiting to die, marking time until he could finally escape the profound inconvenience of living without his sole emotional anchor. Marie Bonaparte observed this final, agonizingly slow decline with the clinical detachment that had become her primary survival mechanism. She was now in her late 60s, a woman of immense global stature and intellectual, formidable reputation. She continued her groundbreaking work in psychoanalysis, publishing papers, traveling extensively, and corresponding with the greatest scientific minds of the era. She had successfully compartmentalized her disastrous marriage, treating George not as a husband, but as a permanent, mildly irritating lodger in her sprawling intellectual life. Yet, even with her vast understanding of the human mind, the sheer, unrelenting stubbornness of George's obsession never failed to astound her. He had wasted 50 years of their marriage, ignored the development of their children, and alienated his extended family, all to maintain a shrine to a love he was never allowed to publicly claim. She provided him with the best medical care her immense fortune could buy, ensuring his physical comfort, but she offered no emotional solace. She knew that any attempt to comfort him would be violently rejected unless it came wrapped in a memory of Denmark. They lived in a state of perfectly polite, absolute alienation. Two strangers sharing a house and a legal surname, waiting for the clock to simply run out. As George's physical condition worsened in the mid-1950s, the stark reality of his impending death forced him to make his final permanent arrangements. This was the moment where the true unforgiving cruelty of his lifelong obsession was completely laid bare. In royal families, the matter of burial is an issue of intense dynastic importance. It is the final public statement of unity, a visual reinforcement of the marital bond for all of history to observe. Husbands and wives of the royal bloodline are expected to be interred together, resting side by side in the grand family vaults as a testament to their shared duty in life. Prince George entirely rejected this fundamental expectation. When he dictated his final wishes, bypassing any posthumous reconciliation with a woman who had managed his chaotic life for half a century, and rejecting his ancestral resting place in Greece, his dying wish was brutally explicit and devastating to the facade of his marriage. He demanded to be buried in Denmark, directly beside Prince Valdemar. This was not a simple logistical request. It was a final, violent severing of his marriage vows. By demanding to be placed next to Valdemar, George was publicly declaring that his wife meant absolutely nothing to him, even in death. He was prioritizing an obsession that had caused his family decades of humiliation over the basic decency of acknowledging the one who had carried his children. He wanted to spend eternity exactly as he had spent his life, physically and spiritually turned away from Marie, completely consumed by the shadow of his uncle. The royal establishments of Greece and Denmark were quietly horrified by this demand. It threatened to drag the long-buried rumors of George and Valdemar's intense, highly irregular relationship back into the harsh light of the modern press. They scrambled behind closed doors to manage the optics of a senior prince refusing to be buried with his own wife. But George was past caring about the political ramifications for the House of Glucksburg. His entire existence had been a performance for an audience of one, and with his final breath he intended to drop the curtain on everyone else. Prince George of Greece and Denmark finally passed away in November of 1957 at the age of 88. His death did not bring a sense of tragic loss to the household. It brought a heavy, exhausted silence. The immediate aftermath was dominated by the logistical nightmare his final will had created. The Greek royal family, desperate to maintain the traditional image of dynastic cohesion, successfully argued that a prince of Greece must be interred in the royal cemetery at Tatoi, near Athens. They overruled the physical execution of his demand to be buried in Denmark, but the undeniable truth of his intention remained a matter of historical record. His body was transported to Greece, but everyone involved in the quiet, tense funeral proceedings knew perfectly well that his spirit, his loyalty, and his entire identity had been left behind in a Danish naval yard decades ago. He was placed in the ground alongside his Greek relatives, a final forced conformity for a man who had spent his entire life emotionally residing in another country. Marie Bonaparte did not fight the royal family over the burial arrangements. She did not shed tears at his funeral. She stood by the grave with the quiet, imposing dignity she had maintained since the disastrous night of their wedding in 1907. She knew that the physical location of his bones was entirely irrelevant. George had made his choice every single day of their 50-year marriage, and he had made it one final time in his will. The man was finally gone, and the suffocating, bizarre emotional triangle that had defined her entire adult life was permanently dissolved. She returned to Paris a widow, finally free from the heavy, invisible presence of Prince Valdemar that had haunted her hallways for half a century. She had outlasted the obsession that had tried to destroy her youth, her confidence, and her reality. She did not retreat into mourning. Instead, she threw herself entirely into her scientific legacy, determined that the name Marie Bonaparte would be remembered for the brilliance of her mind, rather than the tragedy of her royal marriage. Marie lived for another 5 years, passing away from leukemia in 1962. Until her final days, she remained a towering figure in the international psychoanalytic community. She had single-handedly financed the preservation of Sigmund Freud's work, facilitated the escape of dozens of Jewish intellectuals from the Holocaust, and fundamentally advanced the clinical understanding of human sexuality and trauma. She was a woman who had taken the absolute worst circumstances of a suffocating, arranged royal marriage and weaponized her own suffering to unlock the secrets of the human mind. Yet when historians look back at her life, the shadow of Prince George's obsession remains a stark, unavoidable contrast to her immense achievements. She was the woman who understood the psychological mechanics of the entire world, but who could never break the devastating pathological grip that a Danish prince held over her own husband. She died surrounded by colleagues who revered her intellect, a sharp contrast to the man who died entirely isolated, clutching the faded letters of an uncle he could not live without. Beyond the deceptive facade of a thwarted romance lies a brutal, unvarnished anatomy of emotional possession and the staggering collateral damage it inflicts. It exposes the absolute cruelty of the royal marriage market, an institution that routinely sacrificed the psychological well-being of its members on the altar of political convenience and public optics. By forcing George into a marriage he was entirely incapable of participating in, the establishment created a machine of endless, quiet suffering. They provided him with a respectable front, completely disregarding the fact that the front was a living, breathing, highly intelligent woman who was subsequently forced to endure decades of neglect and humiliation. The royal families of Europe demanded perfection, but they were perfectly willing to tolerate an absolute rotting emotional void within their own palaces, so long as the men wore the right uniforms and the women produced the necessary heirs. George's lifelong desperate clinging to Valdemar serves as a stark warning about the destructive nature of arrested development. He was a man who refused to face the terrifying complexities of an adult relationship, choosing instead to remain permanently infantile, demanding the unconditional, uncomplicated adoration of a surrogate parent. He used his royal privilege not to lead or to serve, but to insulate himself entirely from the demands of reality. He built a fortress out of his own grief, locked his wife outside the gates, and threw away the key. In the end, his intense, all-consuming devotion didn't make him a hero of a forbidden romance. It made him the architect of his own lonely, bitter demise. He entirely missed the fragile, complicated beauty of the life he was actually living, choosing instead to worship at the altar of a man who could only ever offer him a reflection of his own desperate need. The wreckage left behind by Prince George of Greece and Denmark didn't magically disappear when he was finally laid to rest at Tatoi. The immediate victims of his lifelong suffocating obsession were the two children who had been forced to grow up in the cold shadow of Prince Valdemar. Prince Peter and Princess Eugenie were the biological products of a dynastic transaction, born entirely to satisfy the ruthless demands of the European royal establishment. They spent their formative years navigating a vast Parisian mansion where their father openly ignored their mother and constantly wept over delayed letters from Copenhagen. Children are highly perceptive, and they quickly absorbed the devastating reality that their home was fundamentally broken. They learned early on that their father's capacity for love was entirely exhausted, hoarded exclusively for a man who lived hundreds of miles away. They inherited the deep psychological scars of a marriage that functioned as a daily, meticulously orchestrated lie. Prince Peter reacted to the bizarre, freezing environment of his childhood by turning his sharp intellect toward the scientific study of human relationships. He did not follow his father into the rigid, emotionally repressed world of the military. Instead, he became a highly respected anthropologist, dedicating his life to studying complex marital structures and human mating behaviors across different cultures. It is impossible to ignore the direct correlation between his academic focus and the horrific domestic reality he witnessed as a boy. He spent his career analyzing how and why people form attachments, driven by a desperate, unspoken need to comprehend the profound dysfunction that destroyed his own parents. Peter also fiercely rebelled against the strict royal expectations that had imprisoned his father. He openly defied the Greek royal family by marrying a Russian commoner, Irina Ovchinnikova, causing a massive dynastic scandal and severing his ties with the crown. The irony of Prince George's reaction to his son's marriage was both staggering and deeply cruel. George, a man who had spent 50 years utterly destroying the sanctity of his own marriage by obsessing over his uncle, became infuriated by Peter's choice of a bride. He furiously cut his son out of his life, citing Peter's absolute failure to fulfill his royal duties and marry a suitable aristocrat. George demanded total conformity to the very system that had ruined his own existence, punishing his son for choosing genuine love over a miserable political arrangement. This act of hypocrisy perfectly encapsulated George's severely warped reality. He felt entirely justified in his lifelong forbidden devotion to Valdemar, but he ruthlessly condemned his son for seeking happiness outside the acceptable boundaries of the royal court. The cycle of emotional violence and rigid dynastic punishment simply continued, passed down from a completely broken father to a son who just wanted to escape. Princess Eugenie also struggled to build a stable life amidst the emotional wreckage of her parents' home. She sought the warmth and validation that her father was completely incapable of providing, leading to a series of complicated personal relationships and 2 separate marriages. She carried the heavy burden of the Bonaparte legacy and the Greek royal title, but she possessed the same fundamental vulnerability as her brother. Both children had been used as human props to legitimize an entirely hollow marriage. They were the living proof that Prince George had done his duty, allowing him to retreat back into his obsessive correspondence without further interference from the royal establishment. Marie Bonaparte tried desperately to shield them from the worst of George's dark, irritable moods, but she could not replace the void left by a father who simply did not care that they existed. The collateral damage of emotional possession is never confined to the immediate couple. It poisons the entire bloodline. The physical evidence of this 60-year obsession did not simply vanish into the grave with Prince George. The thousands of letters he exchanged with Valdemar remained locked away, a terrifyingly detailed archive of a man willingly surrendering his sanity. These letters were not destroyed because George had treated them with the reverence usually reserved for sacred religious texts. They detail every frantic panic attack, every jealous rage, and every desperate declaration of eternal devotion. They stand as a permanent, undeniable indictment of the rigid royal system that forced a man to hide his true nature behind a terrified, neglected wife. The letters prove that the European courts were perfectly aware of George's condition, but they chose to sacrifice Marie Bonaparte rather than face a public scandal. They allowed a brilliant woman to be humiliated for decades simply to maintain the fragile, glittering illusion of royal perfection. Marie Bonaparte's ultimate triumph transcended mere marital revenge. It was an act of supreme intellectual survival that secured her place in medical history. She refused to let her legacy be defined by the tears her husband shed on their wedding night. She took the profound suffering of her personal life and weaponized it to help thousands of other people. Her pioneering work in psychoanalysis stripped away the suffocating moral judgments of the Victorian era, allowing doctors to treat psychological trauma with science rather than shame. She used the immense Blanc fortune to fund clinics, translate textbooks, and physically rescue her colleagues from the absolute horrors of the Second World War. She proved that while she could not cure her husband's pathological obsession, she could use her own pain to dissect the very mechanics of human suffering. She left the world fundamentally better than she found it, a sharp and enduring contrast to the man who left behind nothing but a legacy of bitterness and unfulfilled desire. The dark, suffocating shadow of the House of Glucksburg still held more secrets within its ranks. The royal courts of Europe continued to desperately enforce their strict marriage protocols, ignoring the catastrophic failures that had already occurred. Prince George was not an isolated anomaly within his powerful dynasty. The intense pressure to conform, to produce heirs, and to hide any deviation from the accepted standard created a breeding ground for extreme psychological torment. The story of George, Valdemar, and Marie perfectly illustrates the immense human cost of these political unions, but it also raises a terrifying question about the other members of this vast interconnected family. How many other royal marriages were merely elaborate stage plays designed to cover up similar obsessions? The absolute refusal to acknowledge human reality in favor of dynastic duty guaranteed that this specific type of tragedy would inevitably repeat itself behind the closed doors of other European palaces. The physical remnants of their lives, the sprawling Parisian mansions, the Greek estates, the immense Blanc fortune, ultimately meant absolutely nothing when compared to the psychological prison they inhabited. Prince George had every conceivable privilege on earth at his disposal. He possessed royal immunity, extreme wealth, and international influence. Yet he lived his entire adult life like a starving man, constantly begging for scraps of attention from Copenhagen. He built a world entirely centered around his own emotional fragility, refusing to engage with the reality of his marriage or his responsibilities. He was a man who owned palaces, but chose to live in a dark, self-made cell of obsession. History frequently cloaks forbidden relationships in the romantic allure of a repressed era, casting men like George as tragic heroes punished by society. Yet, the stark reality of his daily actions shatters this illusion entirely. Stripped of the romantic myth, George emerges not as a martyr for love, but as a deeply selfish, emotionally stunted tyrant within his own home. He did not protect the woman he was legally bound to. He actively sacrificed Marie Bonaparte, his son Peter, and his daughter Eugénie to feed his own bottomless need for his uncle's validation. He weaponized his grief and demanded that everyone around him suffer simply because he could not have exactly what he wanted. The royal machine itself must bear the ultimate responsibility for this specific tragedy. The House of Glucksburg and the wider network of European royalty knew exactly who George was long before the wedding invitations were ever printed. They knew he was entirely tethered to Prince Valdemar. They knew he was psychologically incapable of functioning in a traditional marriage. Yet they fed Marie Bonaparte to him anyway. They needed her immense casino fortune to stabilize their own finances, and they needed a respectable woman to maintain the public illusion of dynastic normalcy. The institution explicitly demanded a human shield, and they decided that Marie's life was an acceptable price to pay for their polished optics. Marie Bonaparte is the true, undeniable protagonist of this dark history. She was placed in an impossible, deeply humiliating situation that would have completely destroyed a lesser person. She did not break. She took the profound shock of her disastrous wedding night, the daily grinding neglect of her husband, and the bizarre, suffocating presence of his uncle, and she turned it into intellectual fuel. She actively mapped the darkest corners of the human mind, precisely because she was trapped in a marriage that defied all logic and basic human decency. Her legacy is one of absolute intellectual liberation and scientific courage. It stands in brilliant, sharp contrast to George's legacy of emotional suffocation and pathetic dependency. In the long, heavily censored history of European royalty, the women forced into these specific arrangements are almost always forgotten. They are relegated to footnotes, dismissed simply as unhappy or difficult wives. But their suffering was not passive. It was active, acute, and deeply traumatizing. They were forced to smile perfectly for the cameras. They were forced to present royal children to cheering crowds from palace balconies. And they were forced to silently endure the crushing daily reality that their husbands belonged entirely to someone else. They were the collateral damage of a system that valued the appearance of a functioning family far more than the actual psychological survival of the people inside it. The final image of Prince George is not one of royal triumph or dignified rest. It is a portrait of an incredibly stubborn, tragic irony. He was a Greek prince who despised his own country, a husband who loathed the presence of his own wife, and a father who alienated his own children. He is buried in the royal cemetery in Greece. Surrounded by a family he spent his entire life trying to escape. Even in death, his soul remains permanently anchored in the cold naval barracks of Denmark. He died exactly as he had lived every single day since he was a young boy, looking desperately away from his own life, staring toward an uncle who could never truly be his. But this was not the only time the Greek royal family produced a prince who developed a consuming, controversial, and entirely life-defining obsession with an older male relative. The exact blueprint of emotional manipulation carefully hidden behind the glittering, deceptive facade of royal duty struck the House of Glucksburg again. There is another story of a young man desperate for an anchor who latched onto a powerful uncle and allowed that bond to dictate the entire course of his life, threatening to derail the monarchy from the inside out. Who was this other prince, and how did his own forbidden attachments push the boundaries of royal acceptability to the absolute breaking point? That is a story for our next chapter.